impact on the game, and on the people around him in the game as well. His numbers are fantastic, and you can go back and look those up. You can just to highlight a couple of them. In 1960, he hit .314 with 94 RBIs. He played in the 1960 World Series, which the Pirates won. He hit safely in each game of that series. He was an All-Star the next year in 1961, when he also won the batting title. He hit .351 that year. He was MVP of the National League in 1966, and in his career he won 12 Gold Gloves as the National League right fielder. Now you think, well, okay, 12 Gold Gloves, sure, he was the best right fielder. But one of the things you should think about is who else was playing right field during his career. And most of you have probably heard the name Hank Aaron, who was a pretty good outfielder in his own right, and had a great arm and a great defensive player as well as a great offensive player. But there was no one like Clemente in right field in terms of the ability to catch, the speed, the arm was just unbelievable. He made throws from right field that would take the breath, just take the air out of the stadium. They were that phenomenal. The throw from right field to third is probably the most difficult throw for an outfielder, and he could put one on a line from the deep right field corner all the way to third base. He was just a fantastic player. But he was a player who came to the major leagues at a time that I guess we could call it a time of some transition in baseball. He signed his first contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1954. He was certainly when he signed, he was good enough to play Major League Baseball at that point. And the Dodgers, and this may seem somewhat ironic given the history of the Dodgers, but the Dodgers had a racial quota, and they would not put a majority of players on the field to play, a majority of players of color, and so rather than have him play in Brooklyn and maybe not play too often, they sent him to Montreal. But they were also cautious about playing him in Montreal because one of the oddities of baseball is that if you sign a player, you send him to the minors, and he can, at the end of that minor league season, if you sign him for a bonus at the end of that minor league season, he can be drafted by another team. Well, the Dodgers rather couldn't keep him in Brooklyn because of the racial quota. They sent him to Montreal, where he played extremely well, but they were cautious about exposing him to too much in Montreal as well, because they were afraid that another team might come in and pick him off on what is now called the Rule 5 draft at the end of the season. And sure enough, at the end of the season, Pittsburgh came and drafted him. And I think probably because Branch Rickey knew who he was. Branch Rickey by then had moved from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh, and Branch Rickey certainly was well aware of who Roberto Clemente was. Nobody was going to hide him on Branch Rickey. So Pittsburgh drafts him. He goes to Pittsburgh the next year, and he begins a very, very impressive major league career. But it's a troubled career initially. And it's troubled because this is, as I said, a period of transition in baseball history. It is the period in which baseball is really beginning to desegregate. You think, well, Jackie Robinson was 47, certainly things had changed a great deal by 1954, 55. No, they had not. They had not changed much at all. There were still teams in 1955 when Clemente went to Pittsburgh who did not have any black players. And there were teams that had one, maybe two, but it was still a very, very white game, and a black player was going to have problems. Then, if you add to that a black player who did not who was not an English speaker, a native English speaker. You've got a second problem. And Roberto Clemente once described himself as a double nigger, which is a term that's not, doesn't sound too pleasant, but in fact that's how he described himself. And it was because he had the language barrier and the color barrier, and he had to deal with two barriers. Jackie Robinson dealt with one, and dealt with it heroically and very well. Clemente dealt with two and dealt with those very, very well in turn. He was, despite his great skill as a player, he was, I wouldn't say that he was welcomed with open arms in Pittsburgh. He was, the press, the baseball press is a funny thing. The baseball press can be very, very hard on people, can be very, very nasty at times to people. The baseball press has a tendency to make a very quick and rapid judgment about a player, and that judgment stays with that player forever, or well, maybe not forever, but sometimes for years and years and years before they get beyond that. The press can get beyond that. And one of the things well, a couple of things about Clemente. This was a white press. This was not a Spanish-speaking press. It was an all-white press, and they looked at Clemente, and because of his language difficulties, they found him difficult to deal with. They had trouble interviewing him. They thought he was aloof, and for his part, he was a very bright guy, a person who had a great deal of pride and self-worth, and he was self-conscious as well. I mean, he knew he didn't speak English well, and he knew that this could present problems in an interview situation. And he finally came to the conclusion that it was probably better that he didn't do interviews, because newspaper people had a tendency to either misquote him, misunderstand him, misquote him, or to publish an interview with him phonetically, and which made him look stupid. And he really hated that, and as you can easily understand. So he had that issue with the press from the beginning. The press people also thought Clemente is a guy who had a lot of physical difficulties, a lot of problems with his back, with the back of his neck, disc problems, I think, from top to bottom. It's something that I can relate to. I had a lot of disc problems when I was a young man, and he played constantly in pain. And he had problems with headaches. He was also an insomniac. He had difficulty sleeping at night. And he was always under a tremendous amount of strain in terms of his health. And there were times that he would ask the manager to pull him from the lineup, because he didn't want to play if he couldn't produce at the level of 100%. And very quickly the press jumped on that. Oh, he's a malingerer. He's a guy who won't play. He doesn't care about his teammates. He just cares about himself. He pulls himself out of the lineup. He's not tough. He's not this. He's not that. And that was an issue as well. And so it was a long pull between 1955, when he arrived in Pittsburgh, to 1960, when he first really starred in a World Series, that before the press really began to recognize that they were dealing with a very, very special kind of player. The other thing that bothered him about the press is that he was always referred to as Bobby, and he didn't like that, and understandably so. He found that irritating. So there were a lot of little issues that became bigger issues when piled on top of one another. But he persevered, and he kept working, and he kept playing, and his teammates quickly recognized who he was and what he was, that he was a great, great player. And one thing about baseball players is that they recognize the talent of their fellow players, and they don't care anything else. They don't really care a lot about whether they get along with the guy, or what this guy does or that guy does. If he produces and the team that's the most important thing. And so the initial issues that maybe he had with the press, he didn't have with many of his fellow players. And so that becomes his entry point. And his players his fellow players admire his skills, and then as they get to know him as a person, they begin to admire him as a person as well. Because he was a person, he was a kind person, a guy with a tremendous sense of humor, which very few people ever saw in the public eye, and a guy who was dedicated